Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I am coming to you with a mid-month wrap-up. I know I don't normally do these, and it's so funny to have one of these immediately on the heels of my November wrap-up when I hadn't done a wrap-up in several months. But I realized looking back, I don't think I have ever done a December wrap-up just because it seems like it's something really hard to fit in when you're doing all of your end-of-year content. And it doesn't really seem that pertinent. And so I never wind up really wrapping up all of the books that I read in the month of December. And so far, halfway through the month, I have read quite a few. At this point, I don't know that any of them are going to wind up on any end of year lists. So I thought that I would just make this video to kind of wrap up the 6, I think, maybe it's even 7 books that I have read so far. This is a really varied list. It's completely all over the place, but what else is new? But the reason that I have read so much in the first half of December, is that I got sick again. You can still hear it in my voice. I hope that you can't. It's meant that I've taken a pretty long filming break, but I don't know that I've missed but maybe one upload. But I was really sick, and so I spent those days reading. And then I also have kind of gotten into an audiobook phase, which is something that I never thought would happen to me. Every now and again, I do really get into audiobooks, but it tends to be nonfiction audiobooks. So I'm really shocked that I have been enjoying fiction lately. But let's go on and get into these. The first book that I read in the month of December is My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. And this is a book that has haunted me at night. So this is now kind of a modern classic. It is an Italian book that has been translated into English. It is the first in a 4-book series. And I don't know that I have ever been truly that interested in this because I often hear Elena Ferrante discussed as just truly literary fiction. And if you want to know, I think that's my least read genre, but I'll say in 2023, literary fiction has really come up for me and has been one of my most read genres. And so I felt like if I was ever going to enjoy this book, I might be at the time in my life that it was going to work for me. I picked up all 4 books in this series on audiobook during Audible's massive sale, where they were each like $1.50. And I really could not have gotten the rest of the books used for that, though I think I paid 50 cents for this, which is kind of incredible. But I thought I would take a chance. I think literary fiction might work a little bit better for me in audio format. And so I just decided to go on and take the plunge. I'm glad I did, but this is a very middling book for me. And frankly, it's kind of forgettable. This was the first book that I finished in the month, and I remember next to nothing about it. This is about 2 friends, and the intro to this discusses them when they are older, and one of them has gone missing or has disappeared, has kind of walked away from her life. And so this first book is flashing back and looking at their childhood and their adolescence, which is historically just not something I'm ever that interested in. I really don't like reading about child characters, especially in an adult novel. So I knew this book would be very hard for me to get through, and it would be very hard for me to really like. And I've seen a lot of reviewers say that. A lot of reviewers on Goodreads talked about this book just being a preamble to the series as a whole. Like, this is the book you kind of have to get past in order to get to the good stuff. And I definitely feel that because honestly, the back half of the book, the last few chapters, were really great. But this first book is set in Naples in the 1950s, so it's kind of post-war, and I'll be honest with you, I know very little about World War II. I've said this before. I am just not that well educated in World War II. I know about the Holocaust, and that's basically it. I know nothing about the campaigns. I know nothing about any individual battles. And so it came as a shock to me to learn that Naples had been bombed. And so that was a large discussion in this book, was like kids were playing and they would come across a bomb that had been uncovered or that was hidden for a really long time, and it was set off. Just in general, this book had a lot of casual violence, and that was one of the big discussions of the book, was kind of in post-war Naples. They don't necessarily trust the Carabinieri or the police to do anything for them. And so it's kind of understood that you yourself and your family are going to be the ones that look out for you. And so there's all this discussion about young girls, of course, because those are our main characters. And when men come onto them, it's kind of the responsibility of the brothers or the fathers in their family to run those dudes off or to make them pay for doing anything to the girl. And so this is not something you would ever report to the Carabinieri. There's a lot of distrust for the Carabinieri. And so there's a lot in this book about the Camorra, and the Camorra is kind of a mob family. And that is what's really interesting, is how they came up and they became more powerful by saying, well, hey, when your family can't look out for you, I will. But that's only if you do me a favor. That's only if you do something for me. This was more interesting to me for the context that it offered around post-war Naples and the 1950s in Naples. It was far more interesting for that than it ever was for what was actually going on with the characters. If you want to know my opinion, the characterization was really incredibly weak. And so I have to hope that the rest of the series is a big improvement on this first book in that regard. But I just wound up giving this one 3 stars. I'm definitely going to carry on because I've been kind of encouraged that other reviewers felt the same way, that this book was just kind of run-of-the-mill, and it's really just the precursor to the more interesting story. One of the books that I read when I was sick is A Dawn of Onyx by Kate Golden. This is a book I knew nothing about prior to Goodreads releasing the romantasy category for the Goodreads Choice Awards this year. I know a lot of people were really upset by that. I personally loved it because apparently romantasy is my most read genre, and that is frankly the genre of fantasy that I am apparently most interested in. I would never have said that years ago, but it was really interesting because that was easily the category that I had read the most from. But I had never heard of this book prior to that, and so it sounded really interesting to me. I decided to go on and pick it up, and this is a really interesting world. All of the kingdoms are separated into gemstones, and our main character winds up in kind of the enemy kingdom that her kingdom has been fighting with, has been at war with for a long time, and she, of course, learns that the war is not exactly as it seems, and she meets, of course, her love interest. To me, he's the highlight of this book. I really, really liked him. I struggle sometimes in fantasy romance, and I think just in general in romance, because there are a lot of male main characters, MMCs, that I truly don't get on with and that I really do not find attractive. And I'm kind of questioning everyone who does, if you know what I'm saying. I think there's a lot of not casual violence, let's say, because I feel like in a fantasy world, that's probably to be expected, especially in something that's enemies to lovers. I feel like what I don't like is normally how the hero talks to the heroine. I really don't like it, and a lot of times I find it degrading. And so this was really refreshing to me because he never talked down to her at all in any circumstance. And I just really, really enjoyed that. She clearly had anxiety and depression, I think, and he was just so comforting to her. I mean, right off the bat, he knew next to nothing about her. And when he could tell she was kind of going through a panic attack, he talked her through it. He was really gentle at times, and I just really appreciated that. So to me, he's one of the most attractive men from romantasy this year. But the plot in this one was also really interesting. It wasn't just the romance for me. And that, I think, is why I gravitate towards romantasy itself as a genre, because I want there to be more going on than 2 people falling in love. I feel like that can just be kind of boring because you know where that's going. And so there are elements to romantasy that are predictable. You know where it's going in terms of the romance. But quite honestly, you don't know where anything else is going in this plot. This was really shocking to me because for the first half, I found it kind of slow and introspective, and also very character focused, which I really appreciated. I think that's what romance needs, and that's why I really like romance, is just the focus on the characters. But I kind of wondered in that first half why she was writing this as a trilogy. I felt like most of the big things were going to be solved. Most of the questions that I had were going to be answered by the end. But honestly, the last third was jaw-dropping. It was really fast-paced. It opened up the world in such an interesting way, and it also really explored new dynamics for the characters. I really thought it was fun. And I think it was brilliantly structured, quite honestly, because we were able to spend so much time with the characters and get to know them and root specifically for the romantic relationship before the plot really opened up and things got dangerous. And I just kind of think that was really smart because then we were really invested, not just in them, but in some of the side characters. This is one of the best romantasies that I have read this year, and I'm really excited for the rest of the trilogy. I feel like I'm only going to be able to judge this on how it ends because The ending of this first book was really shocking to me, and so I'm kind of curious to see how the second book will be executed. So hopefully it goes well. I feel like the second book is always when a series lets me down, and we will get to that. We're going to talk about a second book that really let me down here in a minute. But I really, really enjoyed this. This is a high recommend for me. It's kind of one of my favorites of the year, just a little bit, because I keep thinking about it. And I feel like the characters were so real. I also just really, really appreciated the male main character. I have a big crush on him. One of my most anticipated reads for the second half of the year was Penance by Eliza Clark. And I have not yet read Boy Parts, but trust me, I'm going to after reading this. I don't know what it was about this one that caught my eye, why I really added this to my anticipated list, but this was kind of a fake nonfiction, a fake true crime book, and it is about a fictional crime. The whole shtick of the book is that it's written from the perspective of kind of a disgraced true crime writer. And the book itself, when it was published, really got a lot of backlash for how he wrote it. And so you're reading a fictional nonfiction in a way, and I just think that's really, really fun. It kind of has an In Cold Blood, Truman Capote type vibe to it, which I've actually never read, but I think it's interesting because this clearly wanted to interweave nonfiction style writing with literary fiction style writing. And I personally think it worked because I never questioned the conceit of this book at all. It really felt real to me in that way. And I kind of found myself wanting to look up certain structures in the town, look up the town itself. And then I remembered that none of this was real. But this is looking at a crime that took place in a fictional seaside town kind of near Whitby in England. A group of teenage girls basically tortured and killed a so-called friend of theirs, let's say. And so the book is really interesting in how it frames each of these girls and specifically their relationship with the victim. And so it's also really interesting in how it discusses the victim. And that's kind of what's interesting about this is you think to yourself, well, the victim really wasn't all that great, but she certainly didn't deserve this outcome. And so that's what's fun is that the book really makes you think. If you liked The Girls by Emma Cline, I'm kind of fresh off The Girls. I read that last month. You will love this because it had kind of the same unhinged quality, but also really relatable quality in a weird way that The Girls had. Because I think if you've been a teen girl, you kind of know some of the mindset of these characters, and that's uncomfortable to be faced with. In particular, this book explored fan culture a lot and the idea of writing real person fic, RPF, which is always an interesting discussion. But it was interesting to think about my own past in fandom and think about people that you came across, think about people that you interacted with on Tumblr. Tumblr played a large role in this book, and it was so fun to think about that as being instrumental in a case like this because you just really didn't know if anybody was who they seemed to be on Tumblr. And so I just kind of thought this was interesting, and it took me back to my teen days in a really fun way. But at the same time, it was really introspective, and it was also very, very dark. The opening chapter is so gruesome that it's really hard to get through. But if you can get through that, the rest of the book is not nearly as gory. And it also doesn't really talk about the crime in detail ever again. They just kind of give you context for it in that opening chapter. And to me, this was just kind of brilliant. I loved the way it was written. I really loved the writing style, and that's why I want to read Boy Parts. It's kind of fascinating though, because I feel like this book has very little in common with Boy Parts. I don't know that they're trying to do the same thing at all. They feel vastly different to me, and that's kind of exciting to see someone so early in their career really experimenting with genre and with ideas in certain ways. So I'm excited to read Boy Parts. This really encouraged me. At certain times, I thought I was going to give this 5 stars, I'll be honest with y'all, but it never got there. In fact, I feel like the second half did fall down quite a bit, and it got a bit slower. The first half and the first couple of girls that were implicated in the crime, they were infinitely more interesting than who he saved for the last, in my opinion. And that's kind of disappointing because it felt like we got through all of the good stuff before we got to the end. But if you have been on the fence about this, I highly recommend it. I thought it was really great. It's definitely not a straightforward mystery novel, and it's not trying to be. So if you kind of like a more straightforward formula, this is really not bad. I feel like this is just so much more literary fiction, but I also really think it kind of experimented with style and genre in an interesting way. I really don't know how to peg this book, and I really don't know where I would slot it, but I personally really enjoyed it. Let's keep the train going. Let's keep talking about unhinged women. Let's talk about Eileen. This was so good, y'all, that it literally cannot be described. I think this book was just absolutely brilliant. I can't believe that I'm saying this because I feel like if you had asked me even last year, I would never have told you that I would be into Ottessa Moshfegh at all. And it's interesting because I've tried her 3 times this year. This was my 3rd time. And one of those times I just felt okay, like the book was fine, but it wasn't particularly memorable to me. And then the other experience was a DNF. And so this being a 5-star was really remarkable to me, and it completely swept me off my feet. But this is another book that I listened to on audiobook because this was kind of Christmassy, and it's very dark. It's really not an uplifting Christmas novel by any stretch of the imagination, but the majority of the action takes place on Christmas Eve. But this is about our main character, Eileen, who works at kind of a correctional facility for young boys. And a new woman starts to work there who's named Rebecca, and she's really, really glamorous. She seems completely out of place in this small New England town. They, of course, form a friendship and a relationship that's very complex and very weird right off the bat. And I don't feel like I can tell you anything else because, to be quite frank with you, I felt like I knew where this book was going and it went there. So I don't want to say anything else. I had a feeling that it was going to get dark very quickly, and that's definitely true. I really wanted to read this before the film came out, and now that I have read it, I'll be honest with you, I don't know how well done a film of this would be because so much of this book was very internal, particularly the first half. There was like a long stretch of time before Rebecca, kind of the second main character, before she was ever integrated into the plot. There was just a long stretch of time that we were just with Eileen, and we were purely with Eileen in her head. Whenever I read books like that, I always wonder about adaptations of them because I just don't know how well done it can possibly be. There's certainly a lot of action and plot in the back half, and so I'm assuming that's probably the large basis of the film. But honestly, after reading this, I really did wonder how good an adaptation of this would be. But I just was blown away by this. Every time I had to stop listening to the audiobook, it was a genuine hardship because I was literally obsessed with this. I could not put it down. And I just really loved her writing here. I feel like it's interesting that this was her debut novel when I feel like Lapvona and My Year of Rest and Relaxation did not have the same quality of writing at all. And normally I kind of feel like authors hit their stride a little bit longer into their career. I kind of feel like she came out of the gate strong. And so I definitely want to revisit My Year of Rest and Relaxation. More than that, I want to read Death in Her Hands. That's going to be my next one. I feel like she could become a favorite author for me based on this experience alone. Yes, this book was dark, and more to the point, I want to say the book was gross because there was a lot going on in this, and there were just a lot of scenes where Eileen was telling you stuff that, frankly, you didn't need to know. Stuff that was genuinely none of my business, let's say. Just stuff we really didn't need to know that didn't feel imperative to the plot whatsoever, unless it was to show Eileen as kind of an uncomfortably gross person. And maybe that's why that was there, because you have a lot of questions about who Eileen is and why she acts the way that she does throughout the plot. But it's really interesting how the book is structured because she's kind of looking back on her life and telling you about this stretch of time. And I think it's interesting that apparently later in life, she is a vastly different person and a vastly different character than she is during the time period of this novel. I thought this was brilliant. Honestly, this is an award winner to me, and no one is more shocked by this than I am. I genuinely cannot believe that I have rated an Ottessa Moshfegh book 5 stars, but here we are. This next book is going to make y'all wonder, am I okay? I feel like the answer is no, but I read The Bell Jar. Again, if you had said to me at the beginning of the year that I was going to pick up Sylvia Plath, I would have laughed at you because there has never been a time in my life that she has appealed to me. I have never been interested in her. The only thing I've ever tried from her has been some of her poetry, which I despised. I did not get on with whatsoever. And this book was kind of the same. I mean, I enjoyed this. I think the writing of this was really brilliant. And I think the plot line of it was really interesting because it was clearly reflecting Sylvia Plath's own life. But it 100% was not a book for me. The book was not written for me, let me say that. I don't think I was the intended audience for this novel. And that makes it very difficult to rate. I did rate it 4 stars. Part of me wanted to give it 5, but a lot of it is that I was just vastly uncomfortable throughout the book. There was a sense of dread and anxiety that was created in you as the reader that wasn't fun to experience, especially when you have anxiety anyway, and you were high strung anyway when you started reading this. And so it was funny. I told a friend of mine that's what I was listening to at work, and he said, "Are you okay?" I said, "No." I mean, apparently I am not, because I'm enjoying it, first of all. But at the same time, it made me so uncomfortable. I don't know. I really don't know how to feel about this, but I just do feel like, in general, I was not the target audience for this book. She wasn't writing this for me. I don't necessarily know that it feels like she was writing it for anyone but herself, if that makes sense. But I feel like there are so many people who really took to this. This is one of their favorite books of all time because they feel some of themselves reflected in it. And I have never struggled with the things that Sylvia Plath apparently has struggled with. Sometimes she talked a little bit about anxiety in a way that was really relatable to me, and definitely the quality of her writing feeling kind of claustrophobic. I think that made me feel anxious, and that made me think about my own anxiety. What I will say is that it's a very brilliant representation of depression, because it kind of shows the fact that we think of depression as something very specific, and that it would be encountered in a very specific way, that you would see someone who is being sad and you would assume, hey, they're depressed. And it's interesting how she frames depression in this novel as something that is not like that at all. Sometimes you don't have those outward sad symptoms. Depression is kind of a state of being. And I thought that was really remarkable, and it was probably quite revolutionary at the time that this was originally published. I've gone down the rabbit hole after reading this book trying to figure out all about the publication history of this, which is really interesting. This was published first in the UK, and it wasn't published until 10 years later here in the US, when everyone in the US was getting like bootleg copies from the UK. Sylvia Plath must have been much more famous in her own lifetime than what I thought, for there to have been such a clamor around getting a copy of this book. But I really don't know how I feel about it. I enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to read it again. In fact, I might annotate it. But I just thought there was something quite remarkable about the writing. I really thought the writing was very well done. But again, I just don't necessarily feel like it was for me. So this was a really hard book to think about rating. And in fact, I might just take the rating off of it because it feels weird on the one hand, knowing that this is fiction, on the other, knowing that it was semi-autobiographical. So in that regard, it feels like I was reading her memoir just a little bit. And I find memoirs very, very hard to rate because judging it based on a piece of fiction, it doesn't necessarily feel that cohesive. It doesn't feel like there was a natural plot line, or even that there were characters that were interesting or resolved or well characterized. I mean, people were introduced and then dropped off. Well, if that's your memoir, that makes complete sense. But if it's a piece of fiction, then I have a lot of questions if it's just a novel. And so I think this is just a really hard book to discuss and to rate. At any rate, I'm glad that I read it because I do think it was really thought-provoking, and it's definitely stuck with me since finishing it. So I am glad that I read this one. Why don't we talk about Iron Flame? Yeah. This was fairly disappointing to me. I feel like I am most certainly not the only person to have said that. I was really wary of this going in when I saw basically no reviews of this when it automatically came out. There were no automatic reading vlogs. And once that happened, I was kind of concerned about the general consensus on this one. And it seems like most people feel the same way that I do. This was just a 3-star read. And in some ways, that's worse than the book being outright bad, you know? This is the follow-up to Fourth Wing, which was clearly the big book of the year, quite frankly. And I think most of us read it, and most of us really loved it. I think even if you hated Fourth Wing and you thought it was poorly written, you at least let go and have fun a little bit. And to me, that's kind of what's missing here on BookTube, because yes, we are book reviewers, let's say, but for the most part, to me, BookTube functions a little bit like a reading journal or a book club. I'm just sharing what I'm reading with y'all, and I'm not trying to convince you to pick something up. But I also feel like once you become so critical minded, then you really can't have fun anymore. You're constantly picking out the flaws in a book. And I just never want to get to that point. I'm reading for fun. I'm on booktube for fun. And so I really do think it was great to have something like Fourth Wing be the big breakout book this year, because I think so many of us just had fun with it. But it's interesting how the experience of reading the sequel has made me, and I think many others, look back on the reading experience of Fourth Wing very, very differently. Fourth Wing is an incredibly action-packed, fast, character-based novel. It's really moving so quickly. Things are constantly happening. Things are really happening in nearly every chapter. You don't have time to take a breath and think about the weaknesses in the story. And Iron Flame starts off much slower, and I think you automatically start seeing the flaws. You start seeing the holes. And for me, it made me look back on the first book, and I started to kind of question the ways that I felt about the first book and kind of the conception of the entire school, because this series is based around a war college where people are training to be dragon riders. And that's not the only thing you can be, but becoming a dragon rider is a really dangerous line to take at this school, and essentially the school is out to kill you. You don't really question that in the first book because you don't have time to think about it. In this book, you start to think about the fact that maybe 60 to 70% of the students are going to die. There's going to be a very small graduating class. And you kind of wonder about the waste of that and what the point is of the college trying to kill them. I'm happy to say that was actually really addressed in this book. Other characters brought it up and kind of said, why on earth is that happening? But I just, on the whole, feel like this was a weaker book. And it's a shame because I think Iron Flame was always going to be at a disadvantage just because Fourth Wing took off in such a big way. And everyone read it. Even people who aren't fantasy readers read it. People who aren't romance readers read it. And they really had a great time. And so I think this book was set up to fail in some ways. But in many ways, it's also just the second book in a series. And those are never as strong, in my opinion. I'm really excited about the third book. The ending of this got me really excited. I will say, in some ways to me, the ending echoed the ending of Fourth Wing. I feel like we're going to be starting the third book in the same position that we were starting Iron Flame. I also think this book was far more predictable. I am not saying that Fourth Wing was groundbreaking or that it was totally unique, because it wasn't. You'd seen those elements before, but they were done so well that they were at least surprising if they weren't unique. This book didn't even have that going for it, in my opinion. And so this book wasn't bad, and I'm definitely going to carry on with the series. It's just unfortunate that I don't think the book was that good. And I kind of think it's the fact that this series is on a rapid release schedule. This book was released not even 6 months after the release of Fourth Wing. And so I think it meant that she put something out that maybe needed to be edited 1 or 2 more times. I also feel like she might have extended the series from what it was originally intended to be. And that, I think, is interesting. That makes me feel like this book was a lot of filler. And so I'm still really excited about the rest of the books in the series, but it's just interesting because when you read a lot of romantasy, and I guess I do, it's probably my most read genre, let's be honest. When you read a lot in the same genre, you become very, very familiar with the tropes and the character archetypes. And so there's so much about it that's genuinely predictable to you. And that's fun to me because a lot of the time I'm reading fantasy for comfort. And so knowing how certain elements are going to play out, that's enjoyable to me. But on the other hand, that does mean in some cases that the books are weaker for that because you see where they're going. And there is something that happens in this book you can tell is coming from a mile away. And yet it still was really fun. The build up and the payoff of it was still really great. And so that's not something that I'm necessarily complaining about, but there were so many elements here that you could just see where it was going. This is also a far more political book than the first book. And it's interesting because that first book just did not feel that large in terms of world, and this one did. And I don't necessarily think that's been to the benefit of the series. I don't know. I felt okay about this. I definitely still finished it. I looked forward to picking it up every time I was reading it, but otherwise I do think this was just kind of disappointing. So those are all of the books that I have read here in the first couple of weeks of December. I would love to know if you have read any of these down below. I would love to know what you're currently reading, but that's going to be all from me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.